Hello, friends. Ancient Egypt is often remembered for its pyramids, mummies, and great dynasties. But behind its grandeur lay private customs and intimate practices that could shock the modern world. The Egyptians were deeply spiritual and saw sexuality as an extension of both fertility and cosmic balance. But some practices that grew out of this belief were dark, unusual, and at times, horrific. One of the most unsettling traditions was ritual necrophilia. Historical accounts from Greek historians like Herodotus and later records suggest that embalmers sometimes engaged in sexual acts with freshly deceased women before mummification. To prevent this, families often delayed sending the bodies of beautiful young women to the embalmers until decomposition had begun, ensuring the corpse would no longer be attractive. This practice stemmed from twisted desires, but also from the belief that death itself had a mystical connection with fertility and rebirth. Incest within royal families was another shocking custom. Pharaohs and nobles frequently married their sisters or daughters to preserve the purity of divine bloodlines. This practice, seen among rulers like Akhenaten and Cleopatra's dynasty, led to genetic deformities and physical weaknesses in royal offspring. While considered sacred at the time, it was a deeply destructive practice masked as divine will. Prostitution also held a unique and sometimes disturbing role in Egyptian culture. Though not condemned socially, it was closely tied with temple rituals. Some priestesses were said to serve as sacred prostitutes, believed to channel the goddess Hathor or Isis through intimate acts. Foreign records also suggest that Egyptian women at times sold their bodies in exchange for grain or survival during famine. These practices blurred the lines between devotion, survival, and exploitation. Fertility rituals themselves were graphic and strange. Couples were sometimes encouraged to perform public sexual acts along the Nile's banks, believing it would bless the land with agricultural abundance. Pharaohs even engaged in symbolic masturbation ceremonies, ejaculating into the Nile to honor the god Atum and ensure fertility of the soil. To the Egyptians, such practices were holy acts, but to later cultures they seemed disturbing and unthinkable. Another unsettling aspect of Egyptian intimacy was their use of aphrodisiacs and love, spells which often involved grotesque ingredients. Recipes recorded on papyri included crocodile dung, blood, and even human remains, used to create potions or charms that bound one lover to another. These practices combined magic with sexuality, reflecting how deeply Egyptians tied eros with supernatural forces, but also how far they were willing to go to manipulate desire. Even within marriage, intimacy could be oppressive. Ancient Egyptian texts suggest women were sometimes treated as property, expected to satisfy their husbands while facing brutal punishments for adultery. In contrast, male infidelity was often overlooked. While some women held high positions and influence, ordinary wives had little control over their intimate lives. Taken together, these practices paint a picture of a civilization where intimacy was not just personal, but religious, political, and magical. What to them was divine could, to us, seem horrific. Ritual necrophilia, incestuous unions, sacred prostitution, and fertility rites that crossed boundaries of public decency. Ancient Egypt's grandeur was built not only on monumental achievements, but also on private customs that remind us how differently humanity has understood love, sex, and power throughout history. Archaeological evidence and ancient texts shed more light on these practices, showing that they were not merely rumors or exaggerations, but often deeply woven into Egyptian religious and social life. The belief in sexuality as a divine force was central to their worldview. The god Atum, for example, was said to have created the world by masturbating, his semen becoming the source of life itself. This myth was not simply symbolic. Pharaohs at times reenacted the act in ritual ceremonies, particularly during the Nile flood season when fertility was essential for crops. This connection between sexual acts and cosmic order blurred boundaries between private intimacy and state-level religious duties. The incestuous unions of royal families are confirmed through both written records and modern genetic testing of mummies. DNA analysis of Tutankhamun, for example, revealed he was the child of a brother-sister union, which contributed to his many health problems and deformities. This practice was framed as sacred, aligning the pharaoh with gods like Osiris and Isis, who themselves were depicted as sibling lovers. To the Egyptians, keeping the bloodline divine justified breaking one of humanity's deepest taboos. Evidence for ritual necrophilia comes from Greek historians like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, who recorded that embalmers sometimes abused female corpses before embalming. While some dismiss these as Greek exaggerations meant to slander Egyptians, the fact that Egyptian families reportedly delayed the embalming of attractive women supports the possibility that this grim practice did occur. Later papyri dealing with funerary rituals also emphasize guarding the purity of the deceased, which may have been a response to this problem. The use of aphrodisiacs, spells, and magical charms is well documented in the Chester Beatty Papyrus and other magical texts. These contain love incantations where men or women tried to compel the affection or submission of another, often by invoking gods through disturbing recipes. Ingredients like crocodile fat, menstrual blood, and even ground-up bones were believed to harness spiritual energy. These magical practices reveal a darker side of desire in ancient Egypt, where love was often forced through fear, ritual, or manipulation rather than affection. Sacred prostitution and sexual rites connected with goddesses like Hathor are harder to prove definitively, but numerous foreign records and temple inscriptions hint at priestesses engaging in intimate acts as part of worship. Some depictions of temple festivals show drunkenness, dancing, and sexual overtones, suggesting that fertility rituals may have crossed into physical performance. While scholars still debate how far this went, the idea of merging worship with eroticism was not unusual in the ancient Near East, and Egypt likely shared in these traditions. Marriage in ancient Egypt could also be an arena of power and inequality. Contracts preserved on papyrus show women were expected to provide loyalty and children, but men were allowed to take additional lovers or even concubines. Women caught in adultery could face severe punishments, including mutilation or death, while men were often forgiven. Despite this, Egyptian women still had more legal rights than women in many other ancient societies. They could divorce, own property, and even sue in court. But their intimate lives were often tightly controlled. Even Egyptian erotic art and writings reflect practices that modern eyes might find shocking. The famous Turin erotic papyrus, sometimes called the world's first pornographic text, shows exaggerated sexual scenes with humorous and grotesque elements. It demonstrates that sexuality was not only sacred, but also a subject of satire and entertainment, though its frankness still unsettles many scholars today. When pieced together, these findings create a fuller picture. Ancient Egypt treated intimacy as inseparable from divinity, magic, and social order. But this fusion led to practices that could be tender on one hand and horrific on the other. Acts of devotion mingled with abuse, love intertwined with power, and fertility rituals edging into the grotesque.